When I'm asked to give a lecture, I'm very often like Bohr, the scientist, who once said, "I have my answer, but I don't know how to get it." And I often think, well, I know what I want to talk about, but I don't know what to call it. And but it so happened that when I was asked to give this talk, I was reading a very interesting book by one of the professors from MIT, and the title of it was Mind Storms. It dealt, of course, with children and computers, nothing like the subject I'm going to be talking about tonight, but it seemed to me to be very apt to what I wanted to speak about. And as I wanted to also indicate that from those storms there was the possibility of a quiet mind to follow, I chose the title the way it is. I feel that one of the great problems that confronts all students of the ancient wisdom, whatever persuasion they may be, is how to overcome so many of the tensions of our modern life. Wherever we look, wherever we go, we find tremendous tensions exist in almost every aspect of our political and social life. In education, in politics, in religion, you find tremendous controversies going on everywhere today, so that the mind storms which these generate are present everywhere. And in a certain way, I feel that these tensions really mark the basis for the lives of most of us, the thing that really troubles us. I think if we try to sum it up, it's really a fairly simple question, which has to do with how we are to live. How can I live according to what I feel is a theosophical way of life? That is a life which is calm, brotherly, non-acquisitive, aesthetically satisfying, in a culture which is almost the reverse of that. A culture which is violent, unbrotherly, acquisitive, ugly, and so often afraid. So that these things, which are part of the tensions of every individual, mirror themselves everywhere in the social life. Now, as I think I said last week, I feel theosophy is essentially an optimistic philosophy. It's optimistic because it gives one that conviction that man is free to overcome these tensions by his own effort and determination, that he does not depend upon anyone outside of himself to find that tranquility, that peaceful mind which lies behind and beyond all these tensions. Now, in literature everywhere, you will often find stories which well illustrate this kind of progress, this kind of attitude. One of my own favorites, of course, is a little trilogy, which is really a series of books, at least for young people, from 8 to 80, I believe, is the range that is covered in general, and that is Ursula Le Guin's Earthsea Stories. I'm sure many of you must have read them, but they illustrate this point extremely well. You find there, of course, the story of a young boy who is going to be one of the magi, one of the magicians of that particular era. And you follow him through his training, where he learns to work with nature, to control the wind, to control the clouds, to control the waves, and to do all kinds of magical things. And he's also told ways, or at least he finds ways written in the ancient literature, which shows him how to dip into that realm which lies beyond or below life, and to discover what lies in that hidden world. And one time he does this, more or less on a dare like a boy will do. He suddenly plunges into the very depths of things, breaks the curtain between the seen and the unseen, and almost kills himself in the process, and comes back to find himself with a demon that is pursuing him. That somehow he has aroused these unseen forces which follow him throughout the rest of the book, so that everywhere he goes, whether he goes by boat, whether he controls the wind, whether he is doing anything in this whole voyage that he undertakes, always this demon follows him, and he feels that this is like an incubus on his back. And then, of course, towards the end, he begins to feel that he must face this. He cannot run away from it. And he turns and faces it. And what to discover it is? He discovers it is himself. And that when he faces it, of course, he disappears. And then he is free, as it were, of that particular malignancy which has followed him. In a way, I think this is what we are all striving to do. That the only enemy we have, the only tensions that really arise in our life, arise within ourselves. Of course, I well admit that in this day there are many things in the external world which add to those tensions. And of course, some people find that the economic life of our times is such that they live under constant stress to find things that are necessary for their life. But for those who are not in such conflicts, find always that the tensions which are created, if they will examine them and look through them, arise within themselves. Now, I think it's very interesting that if you follow, what shall we say, the occult history of the world as you will find it in the East and in much of the theosophical literature, it shows life having developed in various ways until we reach man in his present state. And it is through these various stages that man has grown. And I think that if we begin to understand some of these various stages of the past, we can begin to understand a little more clearly something of our problems in the present. Now, of course, according to the Hindus and much of the occult philosophy, there are great yugas or periods of evolution through which man passes. And each particular yuga, as it were, develops a certain aspect of man's life, till that is a lesson, as it were, a schoolroom that he passes through until he reaches his particular place where he is today. And these yugas, they have Sanskrit names, which I will just tell you in case some of you are interested. They're not very important, but they may be interesting. The first one, of course, is the Kriti Yuga, more probably considered the archaic one, the original one. And what I feel is perhaps most interesting is that each one is given a color which is supposed to symbolize that particular yuga. And this one is called the White Yuga. Then we have the Trete one, which is the yuga of not the archaic life, but the yuga of magic. And that is colored red. Then there's the Dvapara Yuga, the mythic yuga, which color has yellow. And we today are supposed to be in the Kali Yuga, the mental yuga, and its color is black, representing, as it were, that we are at the bottom of materiality and of the development of the mind, and therefore perhaps in the most difficult period in the whole of human evolution. Now, the White Yuga, I'm just going to use the colors to talk about them. The White Yuga had a complete absence, as it were, of opposites and conflicts. It was a yuga of the unparticularized consciousness, where men were not, as it were, divided and separated as they are now, but partook more of a generalized consciousness which covered them all. But then in the Red Yuga, man began to discover and to develop instinct and emotion, and magic played a part of everyday life. They were in close touch with nature, and the shamans and the people of that particular period thought of magic as quite the ordinary happenings of life, for they were able to control some of these forces which were still part of their everyday experience, not something which was controlled and guided and useful, but something, as it were, which just happened as part of that everyday experience. And then to the Yellow Yuga, the Yuga of sunlight, where there the inner experience was really the experience of the psychic world. And it is this inner expression of the psychic world which I think really marked the whole era of that particular yuga. This psychic experience, this sense of this superphysical realm in which all of them were, is in a way a shared world. It is only when we come to develop the mind and so on that we become completely separate. And we find that, of course, even in our present lives, that when we are thinking and discussing things intellectually, then we are separate individuals, each taking part in this. But when we are concerned with the world of feeling and of psyche, then we begin to feel a group spirit, as it were, which ties us together. And it is this particular world which is symbolized in some ways in Madame Blavatsky's book, The Voice of the Silence. I always feel that all students of theosophy who are really interested in its deep philosophy should study not only books like The Secret Doctrine, which have to do with the whole evolution of the cosmos and man within it, but should particularly perhaps study books like The Voice of the Silence, which have to do with the progress that each individual man makes, as it were, that which follows his own journey through the various halls, as they call them, which leads him ultimately to wisdom. And this particular kind of world, this psychic world, is what Madame Blavatsky calls the hall of learning. This is where we are beginning to understand and to know and to feel something of what our destiny must be. And it is in this world of the psychic nature that has such tremendous energies, and it is there that the real pleasures of life, it is in our emotional nature that all the real pleasures of life are experienced. But again, as Madame Blavatsky says, under every blossom of life there is this serpent which we have to face. And then, of course, we come to our present yuga, the Black Yuga, where this is an ego-centered yuga, and which appears far removed, and in fact not only appears but is far removed from the commonality of inner experience which those who are more concerned with the psychic realm experience. Because this separation of man, which we notice with the mind, this ego-centeredness, is the thing which caused so much of the strife and tension that exists in our modern life. And I feel that a lot of the tensions arise and the problems arise in our world because many people would like to escape these tensions and go back, as it were, to an earlier era. People want to go back and to feel these things, the magic the magical and the psychic appeal to so many, and you will find so many groups which are concerned with ancient rituals, with ancient chanting and things of this description, so that they can feel some of that communality, this sense of oneness with life, which is part of that particular world. But we forget that you can never go back, that always you must go forward. We forget that mind is really the most human part of man, the thing which cannot be bypassed, and which he must control and understand and utilize if he is to achieve his own particular destiny. That the psyche may be and is in fact the source of limitless energy, but this limited energy, this limitless energy, must be used by the mind for life's purposes, whereas so many of us would like to use that energy for our own purposes. And this is where so many of the problems lie. Our actions, I feel, must always be, as it were, for the interest of man, that we must do things in order to form human benefits, and be concerned with the action itself, which really leads us to understanding, and not in the fruit of the action. Not work for something, but simply work because we feel our oneness with mankind and want, as it were, to work towards that end. That the all action is, say some of the Eastern books, for the purification, to use the word which they use, purification of the mind, for the development and giving the mind a non-egotistical character. This is what the mind is all about, not for the perception of reality. For you cannot ever really see the real. It is only when the mind is stilled, as it were, that we can get some glimpse of what reality must be. For it can never be seen, it can never be interpreted by the mind. We can only be aware that it is there and realize that our mental life is in order that what we feel of its nature and of its qualities can be expressed in the everyday life of the world. And so, because we have this past and because we have this present, there are the very great tensions. The tensions of the otherworldliness of many people who want to escape from the whole of physical life and lead the life of very great asceticism in the hope that they will somehow get away from this world and live in another world. Against, of course, the synergic kind of life which is holistic and which tends to make us work as if we were one, and to understand that as we achieve unity in ourselves or with a group, we are experiencing something of that wholeness, which is the only reality lying behind everything. There is that tension between wanting to be, or we all want to be bigger and better and more powerful and all the other things that are part of human experience. But what we are really concerned with is becoming. And this is the recognition of the continuum of our experience, which leads us where? Well, we'll find out when we get there. It is the living which is important, not the goal, which is something which cannot be forecast with the mind. For if you knew the goal, there would be no particular point in going there. You know all about it anyway. It is only to discover what that goal is by right living that is the object of our life. In the Secret Doctrine, Madame Blavatsky says about these things lead the life necessary for the acquisition of such knowledge and power, and wisdom will come to you naturally. In other words, the Buddha said, of course, the same thing, that to overcome the condition of mankind, what is necessary is that we shall follow the Noble Eightfold Path, or it's sometimes given with other numbers too, that we shall follow a certain way of living, that it is that which leads us out of this trap, which leads us away from the human condition, from the sorrowfulness of that condition, to a world which is of course called nirvana, but which is so clearly pointed out that that world of nirvana is exactly the same world as this world of coming and going which is called samsara. They are not different worlds. It is merely a different way of looking at the same world. And it is such a life concerned with becoming, concerned with recognizing the continuum that lies behind it, which leads to tranquility, leads to seeing things as they are, to remove all the blinkers and the blinders that stand between us and understanding. So that, as some of the Orientalists have said, when we look out, the hills are simply hills, the clouds are clouds. There is no concern with any ultimate state, but just the simple living. Now, in trying to understand this, we must recognize, I think, more than anything else, this dual character, dual aspect of the mind. In much of the theosophical literature, one is used to speaking of higher and lower minds, terms which I dislike very much, but which I use occasionally because they are so customary. Coleridge, of course, spoke of the same duality, as it were, of the mind. And David Bohm, the scientist, in commenting on some of Coleridge's work, has also spoken about the same thing. Now, Coleridge called the two aspects of the mind, one the primary imagination and the other fancy. Now, this is the thing that he feels that all mind is really a form of imagination. The ability to cast on the framework of the mind, on the pictures of the mind, all the concepts and ideas that lie within it. So there is this primary imagination, which he calls the source of all, creative perception, that which produces the new, the fresh, the original. That is, as it were, the one aspect of the mind. The other, of course, is the mind of discursive thought. He calls it fancy, and in a rather strange coincidence, some of the translators of the ancient yoga aphorisms of Patanjali use the same word fancy to describe one of the aspects of the thinking principle. And I think that in many ways, perhaps the best way to look at these two aspects of the mind is to think of them as the two poles of thought, that the two aspects are really part of one mind that react together, and that the tensions arise in this polarity. There is the positive pole, which we can call higher if you want, the primary imagination, or that mind which is concerned with insight and with intuition. And there is the negative pole, which is concerned with fancy, with discursive thought, with the ordinary things of the world. Then really they work together, so that insight, as it were, very often passes into and illuminates the discursive mind, while at the same time the operation of that discursive mind in its endeavor to understand, gives clues or pointers which ultimately give us insight into the way things work. So I feel that if we come to understand this, we will see that the ordinary mind, the negative pole, the fancy as it were, always looks outward to the material world. This is the mind that creates our desires, our wanting things, what technically is called in so much of the Oriental literature, karma manas. This is what that mind is, that pole of the mind is constantly concerned with. But the other pole is ever looking within, looking as it were beyond the material things, to the new, the creative, and it is that which recreates, as it were, our view of the outer mind, so that as we begin to develop that pole of our experience, we begin, as it were, to use the discursive mind in a much better way. But both of them, I think, can best be regarded as two views of one undivided mental movement which leads on throughout our whole experience. Now, one of the very interesting things today is, of course, the tremendous interest that is taken in science. Wherever you go, in the newspapers and everywhere, science is constantly referred to. And we very often forget that the major work of science, the important things which mark the leap forward of science in any generation, are its theories. It produces theories which are again a form of insight. It looks at phenomena, of course, the phenomenal world, that is what science is concerned with. But it has this noumenal glimpse of what lies behind, and in this it forms various theories. But we have constantly to remember that the theories of science do not remain relevant and fruitful forever. They are good and true and useful, fruitful. True is not a word one should use with regard to them. They remain relevant and fruitful only for a certain period. For example, Newton, of course, brought forth the law of gravitation, a tremendous insight, one of the most important insights in the history of science. And that, of course, still remains fruitful and insightful in a certain limited sphere. But its general application has been superseded by relativity and the development of quantum mechanics and things of that description, which required an added insight, an added understanding. And I think this shows the way science works. It constantly reasons about these various things to discover how fruitful they are, as to whether there are any circumstances which remain outside of that law. And reason really means, of course, the way in which we compare things. We have ratios and proportions, and in that way we, by reasonableness, come to understand something of the natural harmony of the world. Our discursive language, the language of everyday thinking, is a language, of course, which constantly needs refining, and there is a constant endeavor to display these reasonable things that we have discovered through and to communicate it through the discursive mind. The insight always comes from that other pole, but the expression is always through the ordinary mind. The insight always comes from that other pole, but the expression is always through the ordinary mind. And when new problems arise, the mind should be able to drop, as it were, the old rigid patterns it has created and create new insights. But we find, of course, that we don't always do this. We need what I like to call a great deal of intelligence. I always like to call this insightful, intuitive character of the mind intelligence, to distinguish it from the external cursive thought of our everyday life. But what happens, of course, when we begin to think in certain ways and to look at life in general, that this intelligence really is a kind of mental alertness. I think this is the only way in which it can be described. It's not a product of memory and training, but it's perception through the mind, what the Greeks, of course, called nous. It is part of, or a particular case of, perception, which includes, of course, sense perception, artistic and aesthetic perception, emotional perception, all ways of perceiving the external world. For we see and know and perceive a world round about us in all these ways. We see them not only through the mind. You get things by feeling, by sensing things. And in this way, this perception gives us knowledge of the external world. The perception is, as it were, the primary thing in our endeavor to look at the world. And in a certain sense, you cannot analyze it. You can analyze all the organs of perception. You can analyze the way you can perceive. You can analyze the sense of touch and the way the eyes work and things like that. But there are really not any real analysis of it, only of the way it works. For I think this perception is a property of the self, that inner nature of ours that lies behind and beyond all these thinking, feeling, acting processes that are part of our everyday experience. And I feel in one sense one cannot really have a theory about such things, because the theory would in itself be a form of insight, and therefore would be trying to understand itself. So that in this way it always lies, as it were, beyond analysis, beyond the ordinary range of the discursive mind. Now, ordinary thinking is just the opposite pole of this intelligence, of this power of perception. And the ordinary thinking processes of our everyday life are based upon ideas of recurrence, repetition, reaction, all those things which we notice and cause us to think and to find relationships between these things. And this thinking sets up fixed patterns in our lives. It's what we, of course, called conditioning. And these patterns are, of course, done in a quite mechanical way. We are usually quite unaware of what is going on, for it is a lifelong process. And when things get difficult, do we sometimes begin to examine this conditioned thinking of ours and start on what I like to think of as a reflective thought, where we begin to look and to wonder just what has happened. But as long as our minds are dominated by these reactive thought patterns, by this conditioning, our reflections are dominated by them, and we have, as it were, unalterable, fixed, static responses to circumstances that we find everywhere round about us. This, of course, is what so many of the yoga books are speaking about all the time. They say that the process of yoga is the process of overcoming these fixed patterns which we have created in our mind and which prevent us seeing through them to the truth that lies behind them. And we see it, of course, everywhere. You can see it in your own life if you are prepared to look at it and see the way you react to various circumstances. I know I can see it very clearly. Although I have spent most of my life in America, I still find many of my reactions were created when I was a young boy and man in England, and I still react, as it were, as an Englishman and not as an American. In other words, my conditioning is still with me, even though I know it is there and can observe it. And we see, of course, the way in which this affects so much of our life. When you see the dogmatic religion and the various tensions that creates in our lives, you see that people have been conditioned to these beliefs, and they cannot, even in reflection, see anything outside of them. Everything has to fit into this preconceived fashion, or otherwise nothing is, from their point of view, true. And of course, we see it in the political life, and never more clearly, I think, than at the present day. Always, of course, politicians tend to become fixed, to be dominated, so that a Democrat, of course, can only read the Democratic paper and a Republican only the Republican papers. He is so conditioned to think in these ways that he does not want anything even to disturb his conditioning. But when you look at some of the great problems that confront us, you'll soon see the way in which this conditioned mind really begins to act. Because the way we think of ourselves and the way we think of other people is quite different. We think, of course, that we are very clear-thinking, freedom-loving, unselfish, God-fearing people, or whatever other phrases like this you like to use. And this characterizes us as far as we're concerned. But when we look at them, what do we find they? They are people with fixed minds, they are selfish, they are authoritarian, they are atheistic, and they want everyone to think like they do. Of course we don't. And so we get this great polarization because of these conditioned minds that all politicians and all peoples, every one of us, tends to some to a greater or later or smaller extent in all his thinking processes. He is constantly dominated by that automatic conditioning that he has received from the moment he was born. And it is only as he begins to realize it that he can really do something about it and really begin to have an open mind. And it is an open mind which is the tranquil mind, for it is no longer bound by these fixed habits of the past, but is able to see the new and the creative and to take an entirely different attitude. But when you have this we and they, a domination of our thoughts, when we think of our conditioning and their conditioning, then there is no place for dialogue. There is no possibility of reaching reasonable responses when each side starts off with fixed prejudices, and these prejudices, of course, are, particularly in our modern day, constantly reinforced by the fears that we have, because man has produced, for the first time in the history of mankind, the possibility of destroying himself, and we are always afraid that this may be used. So I think that what is needed in this world is, as I say, what I have called intelligence. For this intelligence arises from within our real self. It is not a process of accumulative knowledge. It is perhaps best regarded, I always like to regard it, as an art of perception through the mind. And hence, of course, that perception leads to the whole subject of yoga and to meditation, which is always part of that process. For if we are to discover that intelligent source of ourselves, it is necessary that we quiet this discursive side of our mental picture and enter into that quietude which is part of the intelligence. And I think that as we begin to do this, as we begin to lead lives which become aware of what is taking place in ourselves, we can do a great deal to lower the tensions of our life. You know, you cannot really seek knowledge until you acknowledge that you are ignorant. Because if you think you know it all, you're never going to learn anything. But if you realize your ignorance, then you can do something about it. And in the same way, it is only as we realize the way that we are conditioned that we can do something about it and really get beyond it. But in this meditative process, this endeavor to calm the mind, to lower, as it were, the storms that rage in that mind and bring them to some tranquility, perhaps we will discover that the deepest harmony which we can discover within ourselves, the quiet sea, is reached not by, as it were, some great illumination, but by being aware of, realizing, and really understanding the disharmony of the thought that passes and produces the mind storms. This, I think, is what our life, as I see it, certainly as indicated in the great literature of theosophy and of yoga and of much of philosophy, that this is how it is, that the mind storms that create so much of our disturbance, that create so much of the mental and emotional stresses that people suffer from, can be overcome by the quietness of realizing that those disturbances are there and trying to hold a tranquil look at them from within ourselves. Thank you.